the My Corner. I'm your host, Camille. I'm here with my co-host, Elisa.
Hi, guys.
We have our cameraman, Luigi, behind the camera. And we have our special guest, Katrina. So for context, Katrina is a family friend of ours. Mm-hmm. We didn't really start hanging out with her until like a little later, but she was always there. Yeah. We played volleyball against her when our little Filipino league. She was
I totally forgot about that.
I forgot about that too.
That,
Two Black Swans.
Yeah. And she was on a different team than us, and then she's also dating Elisa's older brother.
Oh, that's awkward.
No, awkward.
You said that. No, we're one big happy family.
Yes.
So today we're going to be talking about generational trauma. So I guess we'll start with why you're researching this topic.
Okay, cool. So I didn't really know what this was until I came to college, and I started off doing that. Like, I found out that this was something I was like super passionate about and something I wanted to learn about when I did a different research assignment, I guess, on basketball, which is kind of weird.
Wait,
I know.
Basketball.
Yeah, so it was weird because it was like a study of basketball and colonialism, and so like it's like tied into colonialism, so like basketball as a tool of teaching democracy to the Philippines. And so
wait, that's actually whoa.
Yeah, so it started from that, and from there, so like because the whole thing is you have to trace it back to why is that,
Mm-hmm.
and so you have to go back generations. And so like it starts with the colonialism part is like, well, why is this kind of damage being done to these people, and why are those people perpetrating it against their own kind of people? Mm-hmm. So that in itself is generational trauma. So then I decided to zoom out a little bit, not just talk about basketball, but instead talk more generally about generational trauma. Like, what are events that cause this, and this, and how does it affect us today?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dang, I feel like you definitely like went down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
You're just like,
Yeah.
they do is research about like basketball and how they teach democracy, and then it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah, it's very interconnected and it's super like nuanced. So I definitely went down a rabbit hole, but that's what all research is.
Yeah, exactly. Like you just start looking into things more. So then, so for those who don't know, because this is something I didn't even know about until you posted about it on your social that you were doing this research. So what exactly is generational trauma? So like for the viewers.
Okay, so I guess it's easier to break it down. So the word generational, as in like one group, 1 year, say like your parents or your grandparents, they have this like the trauma, some sort of like damage, irreparable. It's not irreparable, but like, you know what I mean. So like the trauma is the hurt, and they pass that down to your parents. And say maybe like what your grandparents do is they're super Catholic. They're very strict, and because maybe their Catholic values tell you that, say, like, homosexuality is a sin, right?
Okay.
And then they tell your parents that, they raise them that way. Your parents believe that.
Yes.
And because they believe that, they teach that to you.
So it just keeps going
So
down.
it keeps going down, and that's the generational part, and the trauma is the hurt. And then say you're gay, and your parents are homophobic.
Okay.
Then that hurts you, and then you are now carrying another kind of trauma that has been in your family for generations.
Oh, okay. I think that's a good way to put it, because when I was researching, it took me a while to like get to the point of what it was.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good way of putting it for those who don't understand or have never heard this topic before, because I don't think it's something that like is like talked about like often, which I think is great that you are researching this and trying to put it out there. So then going into what else?
We can say like, why is it important?
Yeah, why is it important that people need to know this, and how can that affect the future of like their development, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So my goal for talking about this is like a lot of people don't know what it is, and once they find out what that is, it explains a lot of why their world works the way it works. And as soon as you can figure out like the reason why, you can start breaking the chain. So like, you know, like so let's work at that example that I gave about homophobic parents and you being gay. Mm-hmm. So obviously you're not going to be homophobic because you're gay.
Yeah.
And so when you have kids, if you choose to have kids, or whoever you choose to be around, if they're younger than you, you're going to impart some sort of message onto them. Mm-hmm. And that's breaking the chain, because you don't want, like, this is with someone who doesn't really know what that is, but they're still breaking the chain because they know I don't believe in homophobia and I don't want my kids to be homophobic, so I'm going to break that and I'm going to teach them to be accepting of people. So something like that. It works on like a lot of levels. So it's just like the whole goal is if you know what's happening, you have the capacity to stop that, or you have the capacity to change it. So the goal of this is to be able to change and break really like destructive patterns, and then create new patterns that are good.
Okay.
Makes sense. So you're saying that like even if you don't even know what generational trauma is, you can still break it without knowing, just because your beliefs are different from the generation before you?
Yeah, and it's like it doesn't only come down to beliefs. It doesn't just come down to beliefs, it also comes down to like knowledge. So you have to seek out knowledge too to know these things. Like a lot of it can come from intuition, but you also have to put in the effort to figure out, well, like, why is that happening? How can I do better? So the how can you do better part is where you need to do a lot of that research, because there's a lot of ways to do it better, but then there's a lot of ways to have a little thing, like little, like, I don't know how to say it, like microaggressions or things that can slip into there without you knowing. So then you have to keep continually seeking out knowledge from
like just trying to improve. And
yeah, because your intuition isn't enough, basically.
Right.
So you need to be talking to other people who, like, you just have to learn how to better understand people, incorporate new knowledge, and always be open to finding new solutions and like widening your belief systems too.
That's like interesting how there's like so many ways to like break the chain, but like you can do it without even knowing, or like if you do know, it's like even better, because then you can just work towards, like you said, work towards learning how to understand things better and go on. And so then like going off that, so how have you applied that knowledge then to like start breaking the chain?
Okay, well, I think that this research that I'm doing right now for school is part of it. Like, opening up your eyes to something that people refuse to acknowledge, I think, is one part of it. Caring about it and like giving back to your community is part of it. Can we repeat the question?
Yeah. So I was just asking, like, based off what you said, how have you applied that to like yourself?
Okay. Yeah, and I'd say like I take the effort and the time to look into like how do I create like opposite actions of what's going on. So let me think. Okay. So like I'll go talk to people, I'll seek out people, or just open myself up to people who want to speak to me about some experience that they've had, and instead of doing what my parents do and like discouraging them from asking me questions, or like telling them that that's disrespectful. Like if you're younger than me, like you guys are younger than me, and if I like don't allow you to talk to me like we're equals, I would instead choose to do the opposite. Like I can talk to you guys like this instead of like creating some sort of hierarchy. I've learned to unlearn that. So I'd say that the way I incorporate it into my life is I have to get uncomfortable with the things that I'm very used to, and I have to unlearn that behavior.
So that's like what you're doing right now, is trying to unlearn the behaviors that have been instilled in you that aren't the best, or like the hurt, as you say, so that way you can better yourself and break the chain.
I love how you're doing that, because you know people are just like going with the flow, or like if it's not broken or directly affecting me, they don't do anything about it, which is really messed up. So I love how you're like making like going through things and having like how do I say this? Like it's okay to be uncomfortable.
Yeah,
or like
you have
things,
to be.
Yeah, exactly.
You won't learn if you like stay in your own little bubble too.
Exactly.
It's like you just keep doing the same thing, because like eventually like you can only do that for so long.
Yeah.
Before things start to spiral, you need to learn to like adapt and change, and the world's changing around us. Like now, at the time of this recording, you know, we're in a pandemic and things are hard, so people are trying to adapt, and like, and then even with like just life, you need to learn how to adapt. Things happen, you know, and this is one way that, like, from what I'm understanding, is like a way to like adapt yourself to make yourself better and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I guess the thing is too is like right now we're talking about this focus on an individual person and their individual actions, but generational trauma is something that it's systematic and systemic, and it's something that's structural. So it's not something that one person, I mean, it could be something that one person does that affects another, but in the terms that we're speaking of it right now, it's more about like structural oppression and how that trickles down, basically. And I wouldn't even say trickle down, because then it has this assumption that it gets less and less and less as it goes down, but if anything, it's just like a waterfall that goes down, because everything, like, how can I say this example? Okay, so we're in America, right? And America is built on slavery. And so basically generational trauma, you can think of it as like legacies. So in this example, say there's legacies of slavery that still exist today. So like people talk about the prison industrial complex as the modern day slavery. So then how did you get there? How do people make that connection? They go from slavery to prison, and how are those the same things?
Right.
So when you trace that back, it's because there's generations and generations and generations of oppression from a governmental system. So that's like huge, that affect whole communities and whole generations of people. So that's a whole other thing. That's gonna be like another like
it's a whole
2 hours.
Yeah. It's another whole rabbit hole, but like that's like an example for those to kind of get an idea. But I think that was a really good example to how like, well, there you got one thing, this thing. If you look into it, there's like a way that they're connected, and that.
Yeah. So, but if you do want to hear about like that connection, The New Jim Crow is a really good book. It's a classic, and you'll learn like so much. You learn so much about psychology and law, anthropology, sociology. It's a really good book.
And what was the book again?
The New Jim Crow.
The New Jim Crow. Okay, I'll link it in the show notes if you guys are interested, so that way you can easily find it. But don't worry, guys, we got you. That's interesting. That I don't know. I just didn't realize like how much this like topic actually like expands to.
It's like a giant thing. So like the way that I'm approaching it is for my project, I'm breaking it up into segments. So generational trauma, what does it look like psychologically? What does it look like politically, socioeconomically? And what does it look like biologically, like in your body? There's so many different ways that it is just so like permeated into people. So
I'm really curious. Wait, biologically? Yeah, could you go like a little bit into that?
Or actually, can you just like go like touch each of those sections?
Okay.
Like, start with biology.
We'll start with biology.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
So, I'll start with like an example. I do better with like examples.
No, I do too.
You're doing great. I think the examples will help a lot of viewers who don't really know.
Like
this.
It connects us to it.
It connects. You're doing great.
Yeah.
So, Holocaust survivors. Let's start with this example. So, like, there's a study done. I can't remember where the study was done, but I can send it to you.
Yeah, just like, we'll put it in the description. Don't worry about it.
So there's a study done on I think the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So their grandparents have gone through so much. They've gone through like genocide, mass genocide, immigration, migration, and then having to learn to like navigate the world when they're faced against a whole bunch of other things, right? So they did this study with I think like these grandchildren and then regular people to see like to examine their DNA. And the children of Holocaust survivors, written into their DNA is this, it's like a predisposition to PTSD is written into their DNA. Oh. And so it's not just with Holocaust survivors, it's with like, even our parents. Like we have like higher levels of stress. And we have certain genes in our body that have been like ground into it because of our ancestors being in survival mode. So, like, we have different health problems, but then it's like you talk to other Filipinos and you're like, oh, haha, I have that same health problem.
But it's
and they come out
from that. Oh my gosh.
Wait, that's crazy.
And that it's like a huge thing. It can come from different places. Mostly, a lot of it comes from like colonialism, like how do I say, food justice is a whole other thing. Like, what foods do we eat now that were actually taken away from our ancestors, colonized, and they no longer have access to those resources? So why do we eat the food that we eat? And how does those lead to health problems?
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
It's a lot.
Because like when you were saying like all this thing, it reminded me like I learned in like a psychology class about how if like it was about like someone who would be abusive. They were saying that like for someone to be abusive, you have to have a gene in your like DNA that like is triggered for you to become abusive, and it only triggers if you were abused. So like, for example, let's say I'm like an abuser and I like abuse like my family members or someone, right? But like the only way I would have became an abuser is if my parents were an abuser, and I have that gene in me, and then because I was abused, that gene like turns on. That's how my professor explained it. Which, going into your biology thing, kind of like
it's like the same.
It's like almost the same thing, which like I don't know, like exactly. Obviously, this was the intro.
I'm not a.
That was the intro
major.
Yeah, so. But like that's just like crazy how we have these things that were like set from probably like so long ago that in our genes that we didn't even know it. It's just like, to us, it's just coincidences. They're like, oh, you also do that? And
yeah, and it's like a lot of the things that we think are like, oh, that's just how it always, like, that's just how your body is. There's usually like a lot of reasons. Not all of them are because of generational trauma, but you can usually tell.
You can trace it back to something.
You could trace it back to something. It's just like I was talking about, like opening up your eyes and trying to seek out that knowledge in the first place. It's like maybe helps you understand yourself a little bit better. But yeah, so to talk about that stuff, I'm not an expert in it, but I will be talking to experts on it. So then I'll
you're still.
If you talk to me in like 3 months, I can. I can give you the expert's opinion.
Probably when this episode comes out, we'll do like a part 2. Or
we'll do another like part, like update on like what you've learned, because just so people know, currently, we're recording this in December, so she's still in the process of like finishing this up. She's gonna be done. Like, when are you wrapping up this whole thing? Like,
so this should be done in March.
All right, yeah.
So it's a really long process.
Yeah, you've been doing it for like a while. Like this is like your senior year thing. So going into the other subsections that you are putting in, which one do we want to do next?
I only remember political. I don't remember the other
we can do political. So I think political and socioeconomic kind of go under like this very large umbrella, but everything is so connected. So politically, like and socioeconomically, where can I start? Let's see. So okay, that example with slavery, and how it still relates like to here. Like when people are talking about like, oh, that doesn't exist anymore. Well, then it's like, can you explain why a lot of like Black communities are put into these like districts that receive poor education, that don't have access to fresh food, that don't have like good roads, they have horrible housing. Like, how do you explain that? And people will just be like, well, that was their decision. They're lazy. They didn't work hard enough. They can get out of there if they really wanted to. But people don't realize that there have been like all of these legal structures that they were created to keep minorities, specifically like Black people who are affected the most, to keep them submissive. And so, let's see, we can go back to like the Jim Crow laws. So it's like, even though in the law it says like Black people are free, they're not slaves anymore.
But no.
So
they just like work around.
Yeah, exactly. You work around the law. So let's see, like a modern day example of this is if you live, I can't remember what state this was in or what year. It was like not very long ago. I know this is bad for someone who does research. But okay, so there is this instance where it was a matter of education. Okay. And so there was this neighborhood that it was like a mixture of Black and white people. But then white flight began to happen and white people began to leave that neighborhood to like create like a richer space, basically. Like upper middle class people moved into this other space and to create it like nicer, basically like they moved into another poorer area, gentrified it, as in like bringing like white businesses in and like basically taking over whatever local businesses were there, tearing it down so that they can maintain a middle class status. And so what happens is the neighborhood that they left behind, they no longer get like good funding for anything because all of the people who mattered left. And so there was this proposition that this wealthier neighborhood proposed to this poorer neighborhood. Catch my breath. Okay, so this wealthier neighborhood and then this poorer neighborhood. The wealthier neighborhood proposed like, oh, we'll lower your taxes for you. Like, this is great. You don't have to pay more in taxes. And
what's the catch?
Exactly. Okay, so then if you have lower taxes, that means that your public education isn't going to be funded.
You're not getting funding because the taxes pay the funding.
So then why do lower income communities have worse education? Well, it goes back to that. Like, wealthier people are allowed to come up with all of these loopholes, like, and present them to like people as in, oh, this is something good, but also people in that community who know that that's not going to work. They create like even more structures to make it harder for them to speak out and speak up and get something done. So like upward mobility is just not like, it's just off the table when there's so many things like up against you and there's so many people in power that are really working for that. So yeah, I guess that is an example of, it was like really long-winded. I kind of went off.
No.
Do you have a question?
I don't have a question, but like I have like an example of like, basically an example of like generational trauma in terms of like, there's this community called, I think you've heard of Black Wall Street. It was like a very well-established community made by like created by people who are Black, and like it was a very successful area. And then it was just ravaged through by like, I believe like white supremacists or like some other like white citizens. And like it just kind of like goes back to like this like it was the structure like created against them, because I don't think anybody who participated in those raids were like ever like placed in prison, or they were never just like brought to justice about it. And so, you know, it's just kind of like
and that it's a legacy of slavery, right? Like if people of color inherit trauma, this kind of trauma, then what do white people inherit? It's not like it goes one way. So if like, so there's all of these things, like say there's the Jim Crow laws, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So like these are legal structures, and then it's like right now with immigration and ICE, there's all of these governmental structures and laws that are keeping people submissive, but what is there for white people? Not that there should be anything separated by race, but as in there's nothing keeping people accountable because they're white. So that in itself is also racist. Not racist against white people, but racist in that white people are not punished or held accountable. And that is a legacy of slavery. So like if you were white and you were a slave owner, what do you inherit? As generations go down,
you're probably gonna have that like mentality.
You're gonna have like that sort of superiority complex. And this, I guess, is like a little bit controversial, but basically if you're a white American, you are born into a place where you have to constantly unlearn how to be racist. And if you're not, then you're contributing to this system. And most people like usually don't realize that for a very, very long time, and some people never ever realize that. But like the second that you do, you're responsible. You have to figure out, well, like, okay, well, what am I doing that's problematic? What am I doing that gives me more power than other people? And how can I displace that so that instead of me being up here, we can be here? Or if anything, it should be. How do we uplift people who have never, ever been able to gain upward mobility?
I think that's a good way to put it. Because, like we've been discussing most of this episode is, like, what are the minorities? Or, like, people who haven't been in power inheriting. But then, like, what about the people who have been in power? What are they getting? They're still getting this, like, sense that they need to be in power. And that's not good either. Because, you know, it's like, if you're going to just keep thinking that you need to be in power, you're going to put other people down. And it's just like...
So, I guess, like, to connect it back to generational trauma, another example that I was just thinking of now is, like, these... Okay, reproductive politics. This is like a really huge thing. And I'm not talking about like birth control and abortion. I'm talking about the right to even have a child. So like, do you guys know what eugenics are?
Kind of, but
it's not like not, wait.
Okay, so
just explain it.
Okay, so it's like this, it's basically like you're not allowing a certain race to live. So eugenics happened in the time of slavery. So this is like the thing that comes to the top of my head when I think about this, is in that time, if you are a Black woman, having a child sometimes was not your choice, but also having a child was not available to you because under your circumstances, you could not sustain a child because you were living in horrible, horrible, inhumane conditions. And so fast forward now, there's a bunch of like, how do I explain this? Eugenics are still happening. So it now it looks like making Black women infertile so that they don't have children. And people see that as like, well, I would say white supremacists would see that as in like, well, Black people shouldn't have kids because like, oh shoot, there is this quote. But basically having white allowing white women to have white babies, but not black women to have black babies. That's eugenics. And so it shows up in like the smallest ways. So what I'm thinking is, okay, so there's this birth control shot, right? And if you're in a lower income community and you're a person of color, they're going to offer you this shot called Depo-Provera. And there's this myth that black women are irresponsible with their bodies and are irresponsible, period, and can't take care of themselves. So they offer them the shot thinking like, we're going to do you a favor. So you don't have to take this pill every single day at this time because we don't think you can handle it. So we're going to give you this shot that you only have to take every once in a while. And they're like, okay, and then you're all set. And that is really fucked up, right?
Yeah.
And so, okay, that's just the first part. But then the thing that they don't tell women is that it increases your chances for infertility. So
it has this side effect that they like. There's like advertising as one thing. It's like, oh, we're just trying to help you.
Yeah.
But then like there's this thing that they didn't tell you, like, oh yeah, but actually you might not be able to have kids.
Yeah, and so like where does that legacy come from?
Right.
You know. So like that's what this whole thing with generational trauma is. Yeah.
Sorry, it's just a lot to take in on.
I know, and I'm going all over.
I know, it's so interesting.
It's all interesting. It's all interesting.
I'm just like, wow.
Like, I need a second to like, but it's like, it's all interesting. Like, literally, I'm getting like, I don't know about you, but sometimes like I'm getting like full body chills, like something, which is fine.
It's disturbing.
Like, it is. It really is.
It's a hard thing to.
Yeah, because I'm just like, oh my, like I can't believe that's the thing. Like, oh my gosh. Because like when I first just looked it up, I was just like the surface level.
The tip of the iceberg. But like, we're going deeper in. But I think it's a good place to start or stop. The complete opposite.
Wait, we'll be back. Okay, and we're back. So, before we go further, I know we've been talking about like a lot of things and a lot of like there's a lot of history and facts and stuff being thrown out. We just want to have a disclaimer. And we've said this in previous episodes. Our research department is still underworks. I know, like.
And by that, it's literally just us college.
Why'd you say that? I'm just kidding.
It's out there.
But I know we said like in a previous episode that's getting better. And when we said it was getting better, we just added like another person to the team. It's not that much better. So we just want to say like if things are like slightly inaccurate or like we misremembered things, we're going for flow, and we're also. Oh my gosh, sorry, I'm getting distracted. We're not looking these things up just because it's just like 4 of us in a room right now, and the one person who can look this up is busy doing other things. So
I can send the resources because this is all from research, so it's not.
Yeah, like, we're just saying like we might have like said things like slightly differently in the episode.
We're just in college.
Yeah, we're just in college.
We're all still learning and doing our part.
Well, if you really want to, like, if something's off, we'll put the stuff in the notes so that you can look at it. So if you really want to go into it, you do you, man.
Yeah,
but
hopefully this acts as like an introduction.
Yeah, this is all that is. Is like we want to just get out there. So back to how you're breaking this up. So the last section was psychology, right? Psychology?
Yeah, psychology.
So let's go into that. So what exactly are you doing with that?
So for my thesis, I'm going to be interviewing a psychologist. Oh no, she's a psychiatrist. Her name is Dr. Kinlana Ferguson. You can look her up. She's really cool. But that interview is going to be happening a lot later. And she specializes for psychology for people of color. And so what that entails is basically like breaking down what is a microaggression, how does that affect your psyche, how has all of these like traumatic, like actual like traumatic experiences, like how does it live in your body, and how does it affect you psychologically. So like what I was talking about, like PTSD, regarding Holocaust survivors and the DNA regarding PTSD. So like it doesn't only live in those people, it lives in basically it lives in your DNA if your ancestors have been put through such oppressive like experiences that they've constantly lived in survival mode, and they pass that down to like say your grandparents, and your grandparents are always in survival mode, then so are your parents and so are you. But given that we're in the United States, we are not living in survival mode. We have this whole ass setup, and we're not living in a cardboard box. We are not in survival mode. But like a lot of people emotionally and like even financially, people will act as if like your life is going to depend on these small decisions that you make, and it's going to stress you out. People get whole like anxiety disorders based around things that literally like, people are more like I'd say like acclimated to getting an anxiety disorder because of the way that say your parents raised you to be afraid of this thing because your grandparents were afraid of this thing, so it gets passed down to you. And then the disorder part is where when the facts don't align with your emotions and you can't get them to, you have no control to how to get it, so you have to get help. So that's where the psychology comes in. And like it's important to basically to have, if you're going to go to therapy for this, it's important to have a psychiatrist or a psychologist, therapist, counselor who understands those things. So that in itself is like a whole other thing. Like having a therapist of color is a very, very important thing because I don't know, like when you have someone who can understand your lived experience, I don't know, it hits different.
No, it definitely does. Like, it's nice to have someone that you can, like, you're explaining your issues, but if you explain it to someone who's never experienced it or doesn't understand.
It's good intentioned.
Yeah.
But
they can't give you the best results if they don't know exactly what you're talking about.
Sometimes that can't work unless you're working, like, specifically in a trauma field that's for, like, people of color that has to do with race and, like, ethnocultural, like, groups of people. Or different ethnocultural groups of people and how they're living in America. This is all specific to where we are.
Yes.
Like, you know, a lot's going to be missed and you might not get what you need out of that. So, like, that's one thing. Like, anxiety disorders, depression is a really big thing. So, like, depression stemming from, say, your parents and your grandparents don't express a lot of emotion, right? Mm-hmm. And then they teach your parents, like, you don't really do that. Like, that's kind of embarrassing. That's kind of, like, shameful, right? Mm-hmm. So then your parents push that onto you.
Right. And
say, like, but you don't want to live like that. Like I said, with every generation, it changes. And it's not just our generation. Like, this can go back to, like, say, your parents are depressed. Mm-hmm. Right. And you can just trace that back sometimes to, like, well, if that depression, it comes down from your family.
Yeah, it comes down.
Mm. So when you're told not to express your emotions, then when you just hold that all inside again. Obviously, that's really unhealthy.
It's so bad because it just bothers you up, and then you can only hold so much.
And then...
Exactly. So and then there's the whole question of, well, why do you cover up your emotions? And then where does that go? That takes into a whole other thing.
We talked about
this. We covered this in an episode about like the Asian standard.
And very mental health. We talked about mental health too.
So
like
everything's coming full circle, guys.
Well, okay. Well, then I guess I can touch on like another, like this is sort of another like rabbit hole-ish, but like a lot of the things that have to do with emotion have to do with gender. And gender is also part of generational trauma. So when we're talking about like, okay, I'll talk about masculinity. Masculinity is not a bad thing. It just means that is how you see yourself in a gendered idea of what you think a man is. Yeah. So there's different kinds of masculinity. You're different kinds of men. Like Luigi is not the same kind of man as Justin. Mm-hmm. It is not the same kind of man as your brothers. Mm-hmm. And they all own their own kind of masculinity. But there's always like say, there's this higher standard of masculinity people want to be held to, because if you try to act like that, you can get to somewhere in a powerful position. Mm-hmm. So the more you act like that, the more power you really can be in. And so the more you aim for that, the more like you have to put other people down, essentially. Mm-hmm. This is like a whole study of masculinity, but this is something that's generational too. It hurts women, regardless of your race. It hurts like cis women, it hurts trans women, it hurts women of all races. And so that's when people are talking about like the term like toxic masculinity. Mm-hmm. It's not just because it's not all men are horrible. It's the idea that you have to be this kind of man who dominates people, who is louder than everyone in the room, who's more powerful than everyone in the room. That's a legacy of colonialism. So like, okay, so you know how in history you're always taught like, well, this country conquered that country, right? And all of this. It's like, we get it, you have a big dick. You know? And I guess it's like that. Okay, so that legacy of masculinity is also a legacy of colonialism. Yeah. And so part of that is feminizing emotions, because emotions is something that require you to be vulnerable. And if you're trying to fit that picture of masculinity that's powerful and has no cracks in your armor, you can't show your emotion, because that's gonna, if you allow vulnerability into yourself, that opens you up. And that's hurt. It's very painful, but it's a healthy thing to do. But when you're trying to maintain this position of power, not over people too, but over your emotions and like over your heart, it creates all of these other problems for all these other people. And so given that, like, because that is basically like a very huge part of colonialism, that is what's taught to other people, and that's what's passed down generation to generation. So then in order for you to remain, like, especially if you're a group of like, I'll use Filipinos for example, because we have been colonized over and over and over and over. When you're already like an oppressed people, like as a group of people, and you yourself want to find some sort of power in that, and you're a man, you have more power over a woman, and that's like finding power when you're already in a position where you're submissive. So it, like machismo, that's why that exists. So it gives other men a sense of control when it's taken away from you, from your own like government, or from people like let me think, like Spain. When Spain conquered when Spain conquered the Philippines, you feel powerless. When the United States conquered the Philippines, powerless. So then what do? You find power in that position. So what am I talking? Emotions. Yes. So yeah, that's where all that comes from. So then when you're passing that down, like don't show emotion, that's where that kind of comes from, partially. So yeah, like psychologically, that just really messes you up. Then you get afraid of things, you're sad about things.
Everything's wrong.
Yeah, like everything's wrong. And it's like, there's like why this whole process of unlearning is so important, because you don't want to pass that down onto your kids, but you can't do that without the help of somebody else.
That's everything you just said is like true though, because
So you did talk a little bit about how it connects to like Filipinos in our community, but like how do you think in like maybe some other ways it connects to
what
us?
are what are some like the bigger things that like in our community that has been she's like, oh, let me
get her in.
Okay, so what I have like this really big interest in is Catholicism in the Philippines. So like, again, everything for me is like basically it revolves a little bit around colonialism. So Catholicism and Christianity too. It's not just Catholicism. So like, primarily I focus on like after Catholicism was brought to the Philippines, which caused like mass genocide of like a lot of indigenous spiritual leaders. The United States came, and although the Philippines was already like becoming like super Catholic by force, the Philippines was conquered by the United States, which brought over a different form of Christianity. And it just so happens that that form of Christianity happened under, I think, like Teddy Roosevelt, who was super, this goes back to gender, super like masculine.
Oh yeah, he was super.
Yeah, so like that whole like wave of Christianity changed the way Catholicism like worked in the Philippines. And so it ties back too to like domination and like power. So
like 2 minutes.
It's important to be comfortable about
this. Stay hydrated too.
Yeah, everyone stay hydrated. Drink water right now if you're not drinking water.
Okay. So Catholicism and Christianity in the Philippines, right? So it has hurt so many indigenous communities when it's being forced on people, and like the goal of colonialism is to erase, right? To erase like these indigenous practices, the indigenous people, the genocide part, and any beliefs that they had. So relating to the Philippines, like there's a reason why we're all like, why a lot of people are Christian or Catholic. But like you don't hear about a lot of people who still practice or like are very in touch with their indigenous like practices or where they're from. Not all of us know where we're from, but like there are some people who understand that they are indigenous people. They know like where they're from and they know those practices, but they don't practice it. They're Catholic, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just not like very questioned. What else were you asking?
Just like what are like some of the major things in the, like generational trauma from the Filipino community? Not necessarily. Like, so if you have like other things, so then you were just going into the like.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So if you have other ones, you can talk about those too.
Yeah. Okay. So this, I don't know. I'm thinking that this relates to this the most because most people just don't question like, well, what was there before Christianity, before Jesus got there or whatever.
Whatever you believe in.
Yeah, whatever you believe in. There's nothing wrong with being Catholic, but I think it's very important, or Christian, but it's just really important to understand like the history of how that's impacted people from your homeland, from where you're from. Because it just gives you a fuller story, and if anything, it can make you a better Catholic or a better Christian.
Right, if you know like the background,
yeah,
you can understand why you believe in it.
Yeah. So like what I've been like super interested in right now is it's like this process of unlearning and relearning. So like unlearning, like what are some things that that have just impacted me, not so much in like a very healthy way. So like I talked about it earlier, like homophobia was just horrible. We talk about like gender roles, especially in like very traditional Catholic households, like
or
people,
like Filipino households.
Yeah, or just Filipino households in general, because of that notion of masculine power, and who's supposed to be head of the family, and like things like that. Those are reinforced by commandments. Or well, that's like a whole other thing. I don't even.
Like talking about religion, like
yeah. I'm a religion major, so this is like a whole other thing. But basically, like, if you're like a lot of like Filipinos are formed under like the impression of all of those things are right, like obedience, like obedience all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember where that stems from. I have an answer, but not now.
It's okay.
Yeah, but like the idea of never questioning.
Yeah,
it's because like the Catholic Church it's a hierarchy. You can't deny, like it functions very well within that hierarchy, and so that structure, when you adhere to it, it shows up in your family too. You know, like if you don't question your priest about like, are you doing well? The priest is the father of the church. It's the hierarchy. So
so you think they're the leaders, so you're trusting them.
Yeah,
so
and
you don't
so
question it.
for your parents, like say like obey your father and mother. Like that is a good thing to do, but when you
all
don't
the time,
like I don't like you have to be able to think for yourself, and it's kind of like this thing that doesn't encourage critical thinking. Whereas in a lot of indigenous communities, questioning is something that is so encouraged, and it's something that's been like people have tried so hard to erase it because it's also kind of like the base for revolution and, you know, politically.
And so some people just don't want that.
Yeah. And like, so if you're going to try to erase something, you probably want to put down the strongest sources of what would rebel against you. So you want to erase those values that people have held for such a long time of resistance and of strength. So then if you put things into this hierarchy of obedience, and then you pass that down from, these are my beliefs, so these should be my children's beliefs, you know, it just like permeates your whole life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think Luigi had a question that you wanted to ask, right?
Yeah, it was, what are some other like big societal like effects from generational trauma from like besides homophobia and like racism?
Well, I talked about that other big one that has to do with gender. So I don't know if I have to repeat that.
Yeah, I mean, you already said it.
Okay, so like the thing, I guess
skip that.
the hard thing about that question is the word big. So the things that make things big are a bunch of these tiny little things that I'm talking about. So poverty. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so like the thing that sucks, it's really hard to explain these things in super segmented, compartmentalized things because they're all interconnected.
They're all intertwined. And
like you can't talk about one thing without talking about the other. So like let me use the example of poverty. So like we were talking about the legacy of oppressing minorities. There are some communities that have always had wealth. Always. And then there are some communities that have never had wealth, and it's very hard for them too. So there's this gap in wealth, right? And so because of all those generations of wealth and all those generations of poverty, people don't think about that. Poverty can be generational. So That's one thing. Can you repeat the question again?
Some like major effects from generational trauma on society, other than racism and homophobia, because like those are like the main ones. I know we talked about gender, and we also talked about
those are really big things.
also talked about like religion as well.
I mean, we talked about religion. I feel like we've been adding on to that.
I have a lot of things to say. I just need, I think, more like questions to just keep me going.
No, that's fair.
Let's see. I'm trying to think because I feel like there are some other big effects that.
Yeah, I'm sure like we can think of it.
What are some like big big issues that are currently happening?
Oh,
that's a really.
I can do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, right now, I think immigration is like such a huge issue. And like when I talk about generational trauma, most of the time it's within the context of American history. And so like I talked about, like our history is based on the oppression of other people. If you're not like white, you're going to be oppressed. Whether you want to or not. Like it's literally, it's not a choice. That's part of oppression. And so part of that legacy is this idea that America belongs to a certain group of people and not to another. So we only want these kinds of people, so it's usually like white people, to enter the country and to stay here. And we don't want to allow other people into this country because of this idea that like, oh, maybe these, like, especially like this, there's this idea that people with darker skin are dirty.
Yeah.
Like, what the fuck?
Like, yeah, where'd they come from?
Okay, and so, like, okay, let's say there's that, and then there's all of these racial stereotypes that are created to essentially, like, if you do enter this country, we're going to treat you this way because this is what we believe about you. Let's see. So, like, on the topic of immigration, something that's generational is, like, those legal acts that are put into place to keep people out. But they're not really... Oh my god, I'm losing my train of thought. Okay, so there's, like, acts to keep people out that affect people today. So, like, there's, like, all of these immigration acts that have happened since, like, the dawn of our country. Like, illegal immigrants, like, we all know that...
That's a thing.
Like, no, like, the argument that, like, you should keep them out, when in reality, America has never really tried to keep you out, but they just make your travel harder for you by placing all of these things in. Because if you prey on a vulnerable person and you let them into this country, but you, okay, I need to like start over.
You're good.
Yeah, that'll make it easier for you. Fuck, what was I saying?
Immigration, how like, or keep
how
people
the
out,
laws
but, like,
keep people out.
People are still coming in.
Yeah, okay,
legal immigrants.
Okay, fine. I remember, I think.
You're good.
Okay,
You're good.
So how immigration is a generational problem. So, like, say back in the Clinton administration, there were these Border Patrol acts, and they were created not to keep people out, but to make it harder for people to travel into here. So then there are these vulnerable people. A lot of people are refugees trying to seek asylum here, or like a better place to live. And then the Border Patrol is created. So they're not going to keep you from coming into the country. They're going to make it as hard as possible to get in. But it's still possible for you to get in, because the more people of, like, the more minorities that can come in, the easier, or like the greater the population it is of exploitation. So, like, if you make it a harder journey for someone who's already vulnerable, like, say, if you're immigrating in from California and or some hot place, and the Border Patrol is stationed at the easiest points of entry, but not stationed at the desert, you have to cross a whole ass desert to get into here, and people are gonna do it because they're desperate and they need a better place to go. But they're gonna go through all of that, and they're just gonna be happy to be alive and be in this country.
Then you can get them to do whatever.
Exactly, you can get them to do anything that you want, and that has been something that our country has done for generations and generations. And so that results in, like, poverty, because when you allow these people to, like people of color, most of the time Black and brown people, to come in and go through all of these hardships when they're already in a vulnerable position, you offer them a less than minimum wage job, they're going to take it, because you're contributing and creating this system where you need them to be as desperate and as vulnerable as possible to do anything for any amount of money so that you can profit off of them. And when I'm saying you, it's not just like an individual problem. This is like structural. So it's in place by the government. It was literally a Border Patrol Act. So, like, and then this is like even a greater thing, like generational trauma is connected to the governmental structure. So like these are still gonna be some big words that most people I don't think know the meaning of, but you can look it up because I'm very bad at explaining it. But basically it contributes to like this neoliberalist structure that needs capitalism for it to operate. So capitalism can only operate if you are exploiting people. It cannot operate if you have no one to exploit. So in order for this country to be run, like period, in order for it to be run at all, you need to exploit a group of people because that's how this country was built. And they don't know how to run it any other way.
Yeah, because they've been doing it for so long and it's like deeply rooted. Yeah. So like what are we supposed to do instead of that? Exactly.
So then how does that affect people today? Like people are stuck working in these very minimum, welfare is like a thing. Welfare reform has really hurt a lot of people because the government will try to create these assistance programs now for these people they've already put into these super vulnerable positions, and then they'll say, hey, we'll offer you this stipend or food stamps or something. But you have to work this job for less than what you would actually be paid for. So like you have to work for less than minimum wage and then maybe you can get these benefits. Nice. And so if you keep doing that, people are just going to follow it because they don't know what else to do. And so it just creates this generations and generations of poverty. That distracted me and I like lost my train of thought.
Sorry, class.
Did you have more to say about
is there anything else that you want to finish up and then
we'll move on to the next?
We'll start wrapping up.
Yeah. Okay. So like all those acts and like those messages that the government will put out about these stereotypes of people, like lay Americans, like people just like you and me, but not like you and me, like as in they're white or they don't even have to be white. Like people who look at you will look at you differently because of those acts. Like people look at us and because we're Asian, they're going to think of, like, they see us and immediately they're like, you're a foreigner. You don't belong here.
We're not,
like the question, like, where are you from? Where do you think that comes from? Like, it didn't just happen out of nowhere. Like a lot of the time, okay, so like it's very different in the context. Say if like an international student comes over and you guys are talking and they're like, oh, well, where are you from? Where are you from? That's a whole other discourse because you're not in a power structure that was created here. But say if like you're at the grocery store and like an old man, like an old white man that runs it is like, oh, where are you from? And he's talking to me. I want to be like, Michigan, boot. Like,
where are you really from?
Yeah, you're gonna be like, oh, I live in Canton.
And so like, because the legacy of our country is shut these people out, those questions are fine. They're fine with people because that's what they're used to. Like we white people belong in this country, but say because you're Asian, obviously you're foreign. You couldn't have been born here.
Yeah.
You couldn't belong here. This wasn't made for you. And it's like same with other people. Like, yeah. Sorry.
No, you're good. We love that. We love it. The hard topics, the ones that make people like sit there and like, I gotta keep going. Well, before we wrap up, is there any, like, I know you said that your final plan was like your senior thesis was ending up going to be a podcast, right?
Yeah. So I was developing this idea under my internship right now that I have with our Office of Religious and Spiritual Life. So it's actually supposed to be it's educational, inspirational is what I'm going for. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to interview experts in different fields. So I'm going to interview a psychiatrist, like I was talking about earlier, Dr. Kilana Ferguson, an anthropology and sociology professor. His name is Dr. Francisco Villegas. And then I'm talking to two other people that still aren't official yet, but it's Cradle Kalamazoo. They work with the Black infant mortality rates in Kalamazoo, and then this other doctor that I can't say his name yet because I don't know if I have his permission to, who works with PTSD for specifically in people of color. So I'm going to be interviewing them. Basically, I'm asking them sort of the same questions that you asked me, just a little like different, and then they're going to tell me from their point of view, from their research, how do you define these things? Like, how do you see generational trauma show up? And how do you, most importantly, how do you break that cycle? So, with that information, my goal is by giving that information to people that they can do the opposite action, basically. So like, if this is happening, do the opposite. Or maybe you have to try to find, like, maybe you have to talk to your parents about something. You find a halfway point, you bring it up to them, and maybe you can move forward, even if it's inching a little bit. That's kind of what I want it to do. And it's going to be focused on the student experience. So like, what's it like to be a person of color in an academic setting, specifically college? Like, why do you feel certain ways in the classroom? Do you feel different in the classroom? Don't you? So they're going to answer all of like those different questions. We're going to talk on the topic of shame, guilt, PTSD, education, immigration, and citizenship. That'll come out in a while.
Yeah, it'll be a while. By the time this episode, I don't know if it'll be up, but like, yeah, we'll have her socials down, so if you want to like follow it and like eventually hear it, you can totally do that. I don't think there's anything else that we need to talk about. We'll probably have a follow-up episode when all her stuff is done to like recap everything and all that, because it is very interesting and definitely something that needs to be known. So we hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you liked it, like this video, subscribe, follow us on our socials as well, and Katrina's, obviously. If you have any suggestions for topics or stuff that you want us to talk about, let us know. We won't be afraid, and we hope you guys to see you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.